hello. My name is Nick. I'm the head of programs at Asymmetry Art Foundation. Today I'm very happy to welcome you to our event, Proxy Conference, Collaborative Research Through Gameplay. So together with ESEA Contemporary, we're delighted to jointly present this event by Asian Feminist Studio for Art and Research, AFSAR. In this thematic fictional conference, we have 4 interlocutors, namely Mooni Perry, Hanwen, Eugene, and Yu'an, who just met the first time together at Asymmetry, although they have been, in communication for quite a while. So since its inception in 2021, AFSAR has strived to bridge feminist discourses across contemporary art, academia, activism, and communities-based practices. The prefix of Asia brings the localities of Asia to conceptualize a space for starting dialogues with diverse partners. Founded by Mooni and Hanwen, the artist and curator duo has hosted numerous hybrid public programs, including study sessions, reading groups, and screenings. Its online archival platform, which serves as a decentralized virtual space fostering collective research to develop and support sustainable interactions. Their new series, Proxy Conference, is joined by Eugene Park and Yu'an Huang. And another edition of their conference, the Proxy Conference on Boat, is currently on view on display at ESEA Contemporary in Manchester as part of the group exhibition Practise Till We Meet, a group exhibition curated by Zhang Hanlu. And to the audience who are not in London right now, who are watching this on live streaming on ESEA Contemporary, I welcome all of you to join us. And without further ado, I hand the mic over to the members of AFSAR.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for spending your precious Sunday afternoon with us. We're so honored. And I think for today we will generally at the beginning we'll give you some short introduction about what we have done before, and then we will present our individual practice but all connected. And if you have any questions, want to engage us more, we are here for your questions. We can start.
So this is our first research project called Equivocal in 2021. We invite different artists and researchers to do this collective co-learning research project together. We are seven people, but by the time it was during a pandemic, so we couldn't make many public events happening physically. So we used this platform it's called GatherTown. So you can embed your research materials in the cyberspace. And by sharing individual practices, we learn from each other. And that was about this Equivocal project, the first program of AFSAR. And we have some public event through this Equivocal project in Puka Museum in Berlin. And the others are screening. Maybe Hanwen can explain about this.
Yeah, this is also kind of it's fun. Can you hear me? Good? Yeah. So this is a screening program which actually happened, is online, but it's a partner program in Seoul, South Korea. It is a part of a research seminar, and we gathered the film from Trinity Miha and Jianjing Kaisen, and Mooni at that time, she just finished her first chapter of Bin Lang Xi Shi. And it is also a very important practice. I think it kind of like grounded what AFSAR's practice is about. And we will come back to here later. I think people are very familiar with Srinti Miha's work and Jenny Kazan because at that time Jenny Kazan does have a solo exhibition in another gallery, so we couldn't screen her like current. I mean, at that time, her newest film, but the Woman, the Orphan, the Tiger. It is touching on this the theme of comfort woman issue and connected to the Korean, like what's it called, 养公主 issues. They comfort. There's also Korean military prostitution is to kind of quite
And from last year, 2022, we started a new program called From Where I Stand. Maybe this slide, yeah. We invite 9 other artists, curators, and researchers to co-curate the program together. And this is our like collective attempt to redefine what is Asia and what is Asian feminism. And we're all from the different field and different background. And so far we did 5 reading sessions. So we asked them to propose 2 texts which has a strong influence on their practices, also which can demonstrate their understanding of Asian feminism. And so far we did 5 reading sessions. So all these working group members, they present at least one event. They lead the one event by proposing their own text, and also they can also do the screening with us and bringing the other collective in their reading session. And yeah, you can see the public event photos. And also at the same time, we also did some public event. This was like collaborative event between AFSAR and Arco Art Center Korea, which happened online. And the other one, next slide please. We had a screening of the filmmaker called Jin Kaisen, who represent Korean Pavilion 2 times before. And we screening her the film called Community of Parting. And after that we had a conversation between AFSAR and Jin Kaisen. Yeah, and we have 2 more reading sessions to go this year.
So this is the trailer, the short version of the full video work that's right now on display at ESEA Contemporary in Manchester. So this is the 2 minutes version of the full 20 minutes installation. We're just gonna show it to you. We start from there, and then we can talk about the process and the research and idea behind it.
Death is not a loss of life, it is simply stepping out of time. We live in the gap between stories. Sometimes it takes one's personal story to open someone else's eye, to change the perspective, which can lead to really meaningful change.
Italian, Jewish, and Irish immigrants have gradually become the white, merging into the mainstream white American society. The yellowness of the Chinese has continued to plague Chinese American struggles for recognition.
Problem become evident when the Atlanta shooting happened in 2021 in the States. The media has no words to go to identify a clear violence against Asian women took place, but there's no words to identify what happened.
So appropriating house family use
play to understand his death and family, I suggest using play to ask my grandmother questions. So my grandmother immigrated to the United States with her whole family in 1977. The only reason was to chase the American dream.
So there's a short video from the curator who organized the exhibition. So we will quickly also listen from her hello. So here it is.
Hello, it's Hanlu recording this video from Guangzhou. I'm very happy to be invited to open today's talk virtually, and I feel this is also something very characteristic of AFSAR. A large part of their work is to overcome distances of all kinds. Since their founding, they're dedicated to inventing new ways to do that, and Proxy Conference is one of their many endeavors. It is an honor that the group exhibition I guest curated at ESEA Contemporary Manchester, Practice Till We Meet, witnessed the process of conceiving, making, and exhibiting the first Proxy Conference. I can't wait to hear their ongoing configuration of it that they will share with you today. I often feel a kind of closeness to AFSAR, not only because obviously we share a lot of concerns and interests, and many of them are themselves curators and writers. I too spend a lot of my time working collectively with other people, but I've always felt that there's more, and I started to think about it. When I was living in the US years ago, when I've met new friends who are from places like Taiwan or Korea, Hong Kong, and other Asian areas, I would very quickly sense a kind of sisterhood with difference that's happening among us, because we share feelings that would take a lot of effort to explain to other people. But at the same time, it's still extremely exciting to find about all the differences between us, differences in practices and ways of thinking, etc. It is something very reflective in thinking about the social mechanisms of where we each come from in discussing these similarities and differences. This kind of relationship sometimes even is very enlightening for self-understanding. I think AFSAR has done a great job in making this sisterhood with difference a public platform. They have made this relationship more than just everyday chit-chats or mutual help in cultural adjustments and exchanges, but also joint efforts to make new space. I'm very inspired by the written conversation that I had with AFSAR in order to prepare for today's event. In the conversation, Hanwen mentioned the need of a space for negotiation and the demand for a space of translation. They are making these spaces with their gatherings and creations. They are also answering the question of, can process of self and mutual understanding happen together, which I think is a very important question. I definitely share with AFSAR the feeling of not only wanting to, but also feeling obligated to communicate. So I wish you all enjoy their talk today and get to know or even to make sisterhood with them. Thank you.
So we're going to now talk about Proxy Conference. And I guess a lot of people will wonder, why is it called Proxy Conference? What is Proxy and what is Conference? So when I was first invited from Mooni and Hanwen, as an outsider of AFSAR, I thought they really had a particular strategy of gatherings. And I thought their strategies of gatherings are something that we should investigate. So the study groups, the listening sessions, the screenings, it might seem a very traditional model, but there's still something to investigate on how we gather together. And so when we meet for the first time, we slowly thought about the traditional models of belongingness. And we kind of found a lot of historical context and references of the gatherings. And one thing was the conference. So when we think about the conference, we could go through a lot of historical references of the conference, but we were interested in the Bandung conference, first of all, which is also being mentioned a lot these days. So the Bandung conference was opened in 1955 in Indonesia to make the connection between Asia and Africa, to go against the colonialism and to have their own voices, to claim our own voices and right. And it actually created the non-aligned movement as well. And then in the temporal time when we couldn't meet because of the COVID, we also thought about a lot of gatherings in the online community, especially the gameplays. So people will meet in Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube in whatever ways to play game together and to have conversations, to spend time together. So we thought about different models of these gatherings, including these, but as much as we found the similarities, but we still thought there should be another twist in the structure. So for example, Bandung Conference, it's a good example to show solidarity. But at the same time, it didn't really also understand the geopolitics in East Asia, because North Korea and South Korea was isolated because they were kind of blamed as the war crimes in that time, but the Japan was included. So you could see it's never perfect. And these conferences, you could only see it's all the male representative of the nation, which could never be a singular representative of the narratives. And so that's why we wanted to also rethink the structure, how to become together, how to talk about our own narratives to represent ourselves rather than the nation or the ethnicity or the race or the cultural backgrounds. So we started to talk about what kind of conference are we dreaming? What are the goals? So I'll just read the lines here. Proxy Conference is a new mode of meeting and create radical imaginaries of the collective future. It manifests loving, a relational formation of the self, connections to different modes of worlding through gameplay, and Proxy is your cybernetic reincarnation. Speaker and character bleed in each other. The conference is a journey, and the fiction here is a method, enables the non-linear and multiple connections, and the practice of weaving stories. So you guys might have noticed that we are those four characters. We choose our own face filters to kind of blend into the characters, and Yu'an will introduce a little bit more how we worked around these four characters. Yeah, I'm the wolf, and here's the potato, and here's the cat, and the green lizard here. So we have our own diversity within ourselves.
Cross species. Okay, so so for the first Proxy Conference, we started off deciding first, we need to decide the game, and we need to decide the participants. So we chose this game, well, let's not go too deep into the game, but this game is structured around individual character stories, and this is like the board that carries your last wishes. So as a main players, that you have to actualize their last wish and then send them to the bridge and then say bye to them, and then they Thank you. Yeah. So the idea of boat and carrying everyone's last inch of their life, last journey of their life, is a very emotionally loaded space. We choose this game because at the time, like I said, that we have not met each other in person. So the process of playing this game became very important for us to kind of spend time together and go deep with meeting each other. And also to play the game, the first Proxy Conference, to be the players ourselves was also a decision made because that we want to know if for the future episodes we invite external collaborators, what would it be like to invite them to play games together? Would this strategy work? And if it does, how does it work? So there's a few outcomes from the first Proxy Conference. The work includes research material exchange. That was our first 6 hours all day meeting where we are just all in different cities on our laptop talking about topics. And there's also the time that we gameplay together, chatting together, and the recording day. It was 4 hours of recording and just us, each of us presenting our topic that's surrounded on the topic of migration, which is the topic of the ESEA Contemporary Exhibition, Practice Till We Meet. So we had this topic of exchanging, how do you call this? First person material, when you address your writing, your text to someone. So that was the key theme that we decided to go ahead and exchange. And so 4 of us approached it very different. And the third outcome were through the transcript, through the 4 hours of presentation and conversation, that we picked up each other's keywords, and with the intention that perhaps the keyword can activate external people, like audiences, to depart from that keyword based on the simple summary. Next slide, please. So after the first recording, we were thinking, how do we pass on or improve or build on the experience or methodology of how we carry out the first episode? So Hanwen and Eugene work on this mind map to highlight what are the main things that we have to consider when we invite future curators and artists into the Proxy Conference that is surrounded by different topics. So, your souvenir for today. So, we further made this mind map into a colonial-looking map that is open-ended. So the idea is all the viewers can contribute to this map and it will extend. So you can see on the map we have key things that we consider. That would be the journey of participating in the conference together. The game, what game do we choose for what topic? That's also very important. The loving, the fiction, and the figures. All of that has a lot to unpack, but there's one thing that I really like to share, was that when we were filming for the Proxy Conference, that 4 hours filming day, the format was each of us present for 10 minutes on their topic, read out our material. Then we have about 15 minutes of just open fire, not open, how do you say? Open exchange, sorry. Open exchange, so everyone would contribute to the topic. And at that time, we had our avatar on, and we've not met in person. So after Mooni shared her topic that was about family, I was asking everyone's relationship with their mother, this long-distance parenting. And then Hanwen, I've never met Hanwen at that point, started sharing about on the same year that when she lost her mother and she found out that she's pregnant. Then she went on and talked about the state of feeling vulnerable, feeling like a child again, but then I don't want to paraphrase. Yeah, but then that was a moment when I, as a participant, looking like a potato, felt very, very safe to invite into someone else's life that we are here. it changed me in that way. So at the end, the video that we have right now at ESEA is showing, we didn't include the bit where we are exchanging, like what I call as open exchange bit, because we're still deciding whether that part belongs to the participant or belongs to the audience. So that's the ongoing process that we're still reviewing, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the installation view. I just wanted to add on something. So the map you're holding is all the keywords are based on our dialogues. So these are like the anchors that we want to start on. So if you think, like going back to one of my keywords that I was talking about, the conference, what's really different from the conference, traditional conference and the proxy conference, is I think AFSAR strategy is started from building the friendship. So it was not we started to have agendas, like political agendas, to have this one singular goal, but rather we were sharing our friendship, building from our very personal relationship. But we still discovered there is something historical, cultural context within our stories, and we can discover that when we share it to each other. So it's about journey. Rather, we won't think proxy conference as something that we represent as like Asians or as feminists, as Korean, as any identity. But it's rather how friendship can kind of expand your understandings of yourself by allowing someone else to walk into your life. So I think that's what we kind of wanted to emphasize on proxy conference. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Do I want to add something?
Do you want to add something?
Yes. All right. I think that we'll get some questions and we'll get back to this one.
Yeah, so now we can, like, you guys, it's on the stage, the mic is on the stage, so we will have about like 10-minute questions about the proxy conference, and then we will also do our individual presentation of our practices. So, is there any question?
Particularly for proxy conference or AFSAR as a whole.
Also, you may have later, so it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine if you don't have questions right now. Oh.
Yeah.
Yay! It's quite simple. I was very curious about the texts that were generated. You mentioned, I think, sorry, my question's not about Proxy Conference, but from where we stand, I think, with our project. And you mentioned there were about 5 reading sessions that were already generated and people were invited to propose texts. And I just wondered whether you were able to share with us what those 5 texts might have been.
There are much more than 5 texts because, like at the beginning we invited 8 groups. They maybe like teamed up with somebody, and we set up a Google Drive as a text pool. They put all these texts in. So all of these working group members had access to this text pool. So we actually know each other's selection. Therefore, we kind of speak of friendship in that time, remote, never met, it's already can understand each other from that level. I think for lots of audiences who joined our hybrid event in Berlin, like a physical or some online, I think if they ask, we give them the access to the text pool as well. You know, the text pool, the Google Drive, which is selected all the texts, so there are texts collecting.
I want to know what they were to get a sense of what you meant when you were thinking about Asian feminism.
Yeah.
You're talking about talking, but I would love to know what you actually talked about.
I can make an example. Example maybe one of that, like our participant Tang Han, she selects the text and talking about the dilemma of defining Asia, and especially collects the text from Sun Ge, is a scholar from China, and she had a conversation several years ago. I mean, that one is well recorded from, let me think, inside, yeah, that's in Beijing. So he had the conversation, I can't remember what is his name, the professor from America, Japanese, 究竟指数, I can say it in Chinese. Yeah, so she has selected the text also, especially talk about draw on few Japanese thinkers. We got Tokyo schools, and they had studied this theme about Asia but interestingly and also importantly, this proposed instead of talking about the imperial Japanese definition of Asia, more address on this after-war thinking, especially when the Japanese look west, look at China, what happened afterwards. So those thinkers are mentioned in this. Yeah, that's just one example. Yeah.
I want to highlight one because I started as a guest to the reading group, and then I got recruited. So happy. So the first time I went, I thought one of the participants I like to highlight was Ren Yu. Yeah, so she runs this collaborative translation with feminist approaching mind. So it's not only like scholar papers or readings that in this reading groups that they do, like people do actually chip in their time and sit down and work on this document together to translate together. And up until that point, I wasn't thinking about what translating together means. And it was this like very lengthy process of cross-referencing. What's your culture? What's mine? Is this words pointing out? We also like spent an afternoon talking about feminism as 女权还是女性? Anyone speak Mandarin here? And that between China and Taiwan unpack the whole different cultural context. And in Taiwan, 女权 just does not exist on the vocabulary. Even like NTU University is like a gender study or female study. So yeah, we can just, you know. Yeah.
And there's more upcoming reading groups from where I stand. Actually, I have to prepare one, but I'm not prepared yet at all. But there's going to be one also in Amsterdam, because I'm now based in Amsterdam. So it's not only about like Berlin context, it's more, the AFSAR kind of follows where the practitioners are. Yeah, so you guys are all welcome to Amsterdam. So if you follow like Instagram of AFSAR, you have all this information. I'm just doing a PR for it. And then it's... Oh, you did? Okay. Yeah, oh.
Just because we got a question about like how to share the materials, where people have access of these research materials. So we are doing this from where I stand, which is like a much reading-based project. But at the same time, every Sunday morning we gather in the cyberspace called Discord. So AFSAR is operating a Discord channel, and it's also our collective learning about Yu'an, the Hong Kongese philosopher Yu'an's thought on technology called Art and Cosmotechnics. So if you join our Discord channel, we also drop many of our findings in our channel. So that's also the one way where you have access of the research materials. Yeah.
And so I'm now sliding you guys to the individual presentation, but I can still make connection because we talk a lot about translation. Because even though we work as a collective, it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that you're erasing yourself. You're actually finding a way to intertwine your own practices and collective practices. So you have different positionalities, and sometimes also working as collective give you a new perspective to think about your own history of what you're interested in, what you do. And actually what I'm really up to is the concept of translation. So I titled it as Traveling Translations. So I'll tell you one story. My aunt is at New York, American Museum of Natural History. To be more accurate, her face is plastered in the mannequin, which is called the wife in the Korean pavilion, a Korean home. And this means, so my aunt was cast on the street
because they were building this new Korean pavilion at that time. And someone saw my aunt and the person was saying, oh, you have this Korean feminine face. Can I cast your face as the wife? Yeah, what does it mean? So I remember I was walking into this natural history museum where there's dinosaurs, it's the famous museum. And my mom was telling me, hey, that's your aunt. And I was so shocked because I could see my aunt's face. I was so like, what do you mean? I was like, and my mom was like laughing and like she was explaining this. And then after 20 years, I become a curator. And I think about this incident a lot these days. And I think actually my curatorial practice started from here. So the faces, the objects in the exhibition that is not related to the reality, but actually that is intertwined in your reality. So I rethink about the objects inside the museum, the context of the museum, how it was founded. We kind of keep distance because of this glass, of this diorama visual language, but actually it's one of the faces that you know. So I started to think about the faces that passes through this corridor, who has Korean faces. Will they relate with these faces? Will they not relate with these faces? What happens to these faces? So then I thought I would have to find a way to translate those faces. So that is like my curatorial questions nowadays, how we think about these translations. When the objects and the stories are already there given, how do you translate those with my stories, with my community stories, which are the hidden transcripts what I face. And then I think about the representation of those races and cultural ethnicity. And then here I think translation, not only in the literal sense, but also as a practice. So I went back to Glissant's concept of opacity and Trinity Minha's concept of speaking nearby. So translation is a practice to acknowledge the complexity and opacity. So I'm trying to think about the definition of translation, but also expand it into the multiple access by the time and space. Not only translated directly from the language to language, but to acknowledge there's always a gap. There's always a gap. It's never translated very thoroughly. It always has this complexity and opacity. So how do we deal with it? So there are two questions that I want to share with my projects briefly. So the first question that I have nowadays is how can we rethink our time? How do we retranslate the voices of ancestors and become the valuable ancestors, which is the phases that I heard from Framer-Framed conference, which is called Inward and Outward. So that's just a reference. So I made this project called Arcibo. And Arcibo, some of you might know, it was a telescope built in 1963. And it was the very first telescope that transmitted the message to the outer space saying the human exists here. But what happened is it demolished in 2020 during the COVID. And I saw these photos of ruin and it kind of shaped my mind because I started to have the question, if this telescope, the monument was demolished, where does this eagerness of communicating with others, is it gone? Is it still there? Or do we have to find another monument? Or do we have to build another infrastructure? So these questions started to build up. And then I think about the imaginations and eagerness of the communicating with others when the borders are closing, when there are so many crises in everyday life. How do we think about this communication and imagination, the radical imaginations? So this is the exhibition I curated in Seoul. So what I did is I wanted to find a structure that uses time differently and speaks differently. So I made multiple circles in the space, and then I overlapped it with the architectural designer together, but erased the linears and only left the intersectional spaces. So I had like 20 programs, which was crazy. And every time the program was open, it was activated in a very different way. So you could see it had very different programs. So even though it was the same space, it used time differently, it had different languages, it interacted differently with the audience. So there were like yogas and meditations, screenings, lectures and performance and listenings. So I was thinking about the structure that transformed time, that translates the audience's bodies and knowledge in a different way. And the second project that I want to, the question that I want to share was actually inspired by Mooni's presentation at the Proxy Conference, the 是美学 against diaspora. The question is, how do we acknowledge our roots than roots? And how can travelers embody an ethnical witnesses? So as I worked in the museum, I thought a lot about witnessing because I also worked as exhibition coordinator in Seoul. So I was in the system, but also I'm the audience out of the museum. Like I witnessed my aunt's face. And then I was thinking, if we can't avoid the witnessing, how can you use the witnesses? Because we sometimes, when we think a lot about archive, we become very negative about witnessing the historical facts. But actually, we're witnessing everything, you know. There are incidents that are happening in the world every day. What do we do with it? So this is the game I made. So I do a lot of crazy things. I met an artist, the graphic designers together, and we created this little game called the Stone Circle. So the story goes like this. There's a conservator in the museum, and he one day discovers the videotape. So he wants to restore the videotape, digitizing, and then one by one, he or they or she kind of interacts with secret rooms, the secrets of the museum. And this is, it's only in Korean, I'm working on the translation, but this is like the screenshot of the gameplay. So what I was thinking was about how museums were built. So this is the first room. It's the room of the Tomb Raider. So the narrative invites the audience to become another Tomb Raider. And then what I did is, throughout the research about the British Museum, about a lot of museums, I actually found out there are photos that are called loots, more loots. So it's stealing from other regions and other localities, their monuments. And then I put this like fictional text, essays, research methodology as part of the game with the image together. So I engaged the audience to become another Tomb Raider, but also to seek into the secret of the museum. So it's actually a research project, a cool research project. Yeah.
She coded it herself.
Yeah, I coded it myself.
Extra credit.
Yeah. I was very busy last year. Yeah, so this is like example. I'm still working on translation, so hope one day I can still publish this game as an English version. But yeah, this is just an example. And yeah, coming back, I guess some of you guys, you know the reference. So going back to the two questions that I share, this is a very open-ended question. I don't really have a singular answer. I don't want singular answers. I'm just sharing these questions to my peers, my friends, my colleagues, and I think this journey can never be done alone. It has to be a journey that transforms us through the translation. So I will end my presentation by reading Yu'an Huang's text on the Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous. That was also part of my presentation at Proxy Conference, and it kind of resonates a lot, so I'll read it. Migration can be triggered by the angle of sunlight, indicating a change in season, temperature, plant life, and food supply. Female monarchs lay eggs along the route. Every history has more than one thread, each thread a story of division. The journey takes 4,830 miles, more than the length of this country. The monarchs that fly south will not make it back to north. Each departure then is final. Only their children return. Only the future revisits the past. Thank you. And then, so we also didn't want to make a very
presentation. So I'm going to ask Hanwen a question. We had a rehearsal and we wanted to, we are always twisting anything. So my question to Hanwen would be, when I was first invited to AFSAR, I saw this word Asia feminism and Asia feminist practice. And I still question that term a lot. You know, what is Asia and what is feminism? And Asia feminism? Oh, that's weird. And I also still find a way how to use this term. And I see AFSAR has done a lot of projects before I come. And I wanted to ask Hanwen how you play around those terms and how you, not being used or consumed by the terminology, but how do you play around with it?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so I think my part will be focusing on contextualizing the term Asian feminism. And I'd like to share with you the dilemmas we had along the way. And I also want to venture my thoughts by drawing on a few separate examples. Can I have the first slide, please? The first slide you can see on top left, a virtual remake of the statue piece, which is dedicated to the commemorating so-called comfort women who were subjected to military sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Pacific War. The sculpture, the supposed symbol of a transnational memory movement, has to defend its own existence in the context of international relations. A moment of solidarity among the dispersed Asian communities flashed at this set of Berlin statue piece during the Stop Asian Hate demonstration. In the middle, you see that's a digital archiving project called Archive of Refuge by the House of the Culture of the World in Berlin. In short, it represents an institutional approach to give voice to the representatives of the deprived people who migrate to Germany, quote, as an integral part of German post-war history. Top right, you see a black-white photo depicts the West German hospital ship moored at South Vietnam in 1970, and a propaganda poster of German Democratic Republic from 1975 that reads, "We help the farmers of Vietnam." Finally, the bottom right, you see a screening and discussion at Berlin Gates Museum organized by our friend Tao Ho, who is the initiator of a collective called DAM, which means German Asians Make Noise. This small event reflects on the alternative ways of archiving through the media and film. So speaking of a scope, a tool, I want to contemplate on the following questions. What can this perspective bring together? How does this lead to new process of recognition, connection, and perhaps new artistic practice? What new imaginaries it might be able to forge? As a demystifying force, the intersection of feminism and post-colonial practice has been revolving around the issue of representation and the burden of representation. I think these following 3 points, relational practice, citational network, and queer archiving, resonates with the turn from representation to alternative infrastructure. What constitutes the unity of Asia, a region without definable counter that never unified by a single religion, language, political system, or even historical experience of colonization? To use the term Asian feminism broadly, takes a similar approach as the third world feminism did and does. However, without offering a concrete answer of what Asian feminism is and who count as Asian feminists, I'd like to address a mutual effect, an interplay, if you like, of those two words which can review the purpose of this combination. First, the prefix Asian to feminism. How can those women and those marginalized communities re-examine, reshape, and give feminism other layers of meanings or even correct it? Second, we also ask, how does feminism shift, question, or destabilize the notion of Asia, therefore complicate defining Asia and Asianness? So these have been the essential questions that we have striving to answer with the project in AFSAR. If you have noticed our logo, maybe you can see that on the map, the word Asian is set in a pair of brackets. I must admit that these brackets, in fact, came from our struggle and compromise of naming. The effect of the brackets is to silence the word within, and it hence became merely indicative. Because by knowing this struggle, our graphic designer expressly taking it as an inspiration. Those primary thoughts speak volumes for more of the internal struggle that we had. Of course, we're not alone. In 2022, we sat together with 6 other Berlin-based art and culture collectives with Asian roots. We recognize our shared sense of awkwardness in our approach to make difference. Yeah, that's right, that one. Yeah, aphasia, unable and unwilling. This quote reviews the two folds of the disadvantaged situation. In relation to language and the limitation of a word, it suggests a sense of disconnection or alienation from language, as well as a resistance to dominant form of discourse. If the situation of unable is rendered by displacement, uprootedness, a sense of awkwardness and incomplete, and then the active positioning of unwilling reassert agency to set a line of resistance. To speak again differently, this speaking again realized in relational practice of actively connecting with many other struggles by quoting their words, their experience. Let them be inspiring and take a leash of life in us, in our stories. In the year 1955, Bandung Conference, it was also the year the outbreak of Vietnam War. Late 60s, as student anti-war demonstrations were at its height, queer transnational movement allied itself with the anti-war protests. Squarely enough, it perhaps seems, the gay liberation in the context of Vietnam years does provide a framework for understanding and challenging the ways in which images of queer kinship beyond this brutal solidarity were missing and glossed over within the liberational context. Solidarities also include the East Germany, North Vietnam versus West Germany with South Vietnam. But what kind of analysis was it? The work by the artist Song Chiu, the current one, Block G, at her current exhibition called No Job, No Country, reviews a floor plan of one of the 9 identical Plattenbau buildings for Vietnamese contract worker who lived under restricted regulations and constant supervision in around 5 square meters of living space per person. With this site-specific work, the history of Germany's housing policy for asylum seekers from Yugoslavia and Middle East in the 90s was also invoked. Once a Vietnamese American friend told me that Chinese people who migrate to Vietnam were called the boat people. In the context of the late and post-Vietnam War period of 1975 to 1995, the refugees who fled Vietnam were commonly referred also as boat people. Asterisk is often used as a symbol to represent a placeholder for missing or unknown word or character, Chunchang, that there were so many images missing in queer relational practice, and making self-reference to hold the space can be the necessary method. If the brackets were as a symbol of our struggle on representation, then the asterisk is an indication for critical network and a queer archive that sets a pattern for an alternative infrastructures. Thank you. Me and Mooni have started, like we had lots of conversations between us to discuss, like this struggle I address is mostly between us. If we put Asian there, what kind of Asian, what do you want to do with this word? It's like, it's really like almost a year-long, few years struggle. It's still continuing. So we take a very different approach on that, and we have different practice. I really want to hear about Mooni's journey on that.
Thank you. Actually, apart from our platform AFSAR, I'm also working as a visual artist. I'm making So today I'm gonna introduce some of my work. Next slide, please. This work indicating a question, a very big question. What is East Asia cosmology? Because now I'm working on a science fiction project, and I want to know if there's such science fiction can be like which is written in East Asia cosmology, what it would be, and that is my question, and that's something I want to share with you. These kind of big questions. So technology is about creating and producing something, namely poiesis in Greek, and nature is something not produced and or not created by humans, right? And it has been there is very beginning. So nature is always there, and on the other hand, culture is always created by the human being. And how we frame culture and nature can be differed by its own cosmology. For example, there are 4 different ontologies proposed in Beyond Nature and Culture by Philippe Descola, the French philosopher, namely naturalism, animism, totemism, and analogism. Each of these ontologies inscribe nature in a different way, which reveals the dominant view we contemporary people take for granted, namely naturalism, is not universal. So this is also echoing to our study session, the one I just introduced. We are studying about Yuqui's thought, and Yuqui is famous for his claiming that technology is not universal, it's never be a universal, and that therefore this is our task to rewrite the history of the technology depending on different cosmologies we are living in. And compared to the naturalism, one good example of analogism is the East Asian medicine or mediology. When talking about, this is one example of East Asian mediology. When talking about the bone in our body, in East Asia medicine, it is considered to be outside, but we consider it to be inside of our body, right? But actually in East Asia medicine, it is outside. The bone supposed to be, or like considered to be outside, because there is no qi. Qi is like energy or the vital force in Eastern thinking. Because there is no qi flowing there, because in East Asia cosmology, body can be constructed by gathering and scattering of qi, and bone doesn't have it. And the next question is, what is fantasicness in East Asia? As I say, qi in East Asia is really the key in thought and in culture. Every being in this universe is constituted by qi. Therefore, there is no such a clear distinction between human and non-human. Non-human also include the ghost. That's why we've seen a lot of these ghosty stories in in Hong Kongese film, like in 90s. This is why the fantasy was the essence of the East Asia classic literature. And you see a lot of creatures and also love stories between those creatures. Creatures means like fairy and yokoi and ghost and so on. The theory of qi takes another step to explain the principle behind Taoism cosmology, as well as the change of all things, recognizing all existence as the outcome of process encompassing collection and dispersal of qi. The cosmology of qi Hua believe that the change in qi lead to the formation of the universe. And this such belief serves as a background for popularity of the stories that involved ghosts and spirits in East Asia cultures. And maybe we jump to the next slide. The Chinese translation of fantasy is Qi-huan. Qi-huan is something that is different from the others, something that deviates from the ordinary, but then something valuable. Just because it's like beyond the normality, it became valuable and precious at the same time. Something that changes so often, that appears and disappears, or something that comes and goes, and vice versa. A certain movement that blurs people's judgment, a change. This is the definition of Qi-huan, the Chinese translation of fantasy. The next question I want to address today is the history of science fiction in East Asia. It was my previous research project, so I tried to map the history of science fiction in China, Japan, and Korea. And today I will just focus on Korean context, because I'm from Korea. It is indeed interesting to know how science fiction grow and shift in East Asia, and also to know the similarities and differences between East Asian countries, Korea, China, and Japan, and so on. As I say, East Asian culture sphere shares the same cosmology root, and the fantasicness, same cosmology root and the fantasicness. But I was wondering, despite this fertile, very rich ground for the imaginative works, there seems to be a prevailing the dominance of Western fantasy and science fiction. That was my question. And in order to understand it partially, I will simplify the history of science fiction in Korea shortly. So in 1907, science fiction first arrived on Korean peninsula through various means, primarily emphasizing the idea that nations' modernization and the progress of Western science and technology would be achieved through this genre. So the government used this as a strategy to adopt the Western modernization. Their goal was not to introduce the concept of the science itself, but rather the genre of science fiction. They aimed to bring Western-style civilization to the Korean peninsula, following the idea that science equals civilization, which was a prevailing notion until 1920s. During the Japanese colonial period, science fiction were deemed forbidden and prohibited. So that's why we kind of slowly lose lose the advancement of science fiction. I just make it very short. Next slide, please. And this is one of my current projects, addressing the question, what would East Asia science fiction be? And science fiction written within East Asia cosmology, which I briefly explained earlier, has many layers to consider. Firstly, I want to clarify that my main focus is not on exploring the differences between genre, fantasy, and science fiction. Many novels categorized as science fiction don't necessarily explain the worldview scientifically, but instead concentrate on thought experiment within the story. Secondly, when it comes to the genre fantasy, people read it to experience the secondary world that is distinct from the real world, the world we are living in, namely the first world. Korean fantasy novels and games and animations often contain elements from the medieval Europe. And why? However, it would be too simplistic to label this as Occidentalism. In the Korean context, many young writers in the late 90s and early 2000s wanted to challenge the conservative literary field. So they chose the medieval Europe as their setting because it was simply the most distant secondary world they can ever imagine, both geographically and cognitively. It's not a world that mimics the history, the real history, but rather a world constructed as a separate realm. Maybe next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. And the genres are often, or most of the time, always intersecting each other. For example, romance and thriller, BL and GL. I don't know if you know what is BL and GL. It's like boys' love and girls' love. And science fiction, they always intersect each other. And science fiction is a place for the thought experiment. Science fiction isn't just a story made up of fanciful ideas. Instead, it has a realistically and critical and radical essence. This is because the imagination pursued by science fiction stems from the desire to transcend normality. And that's why I put the slide here about science fiction and queerness and my previous research on the genre girls' love. Yeah. That's the end of my presentation. I hope it was not too long. Thank you. I have a question for you. So I talk about the secondary world when I talk about this fantasy world, right? But at the same time, the other world, which is not transcendental, but rather see this world in another angle. And we are traveling one world to the other. And maybe Yu'an can explain more about locality and physical space and transcendental space.
So, hi. Yes, okay. I know it's a lot of information. So I have a moment to process everyone. My part is going to be lighter, I hope, and I'm going to start it with asking this question: does it matter where you are, where we are? So my name is Yuan, I'm a curator, and I was trained in fine art, but then I naturally start organizing public programming, parties, and exhibitions. So I'm like a self-made curator. And last year I was a curatorial fellow, a Asymmetry curatorial fellow, who finished my placement at Chisenhall. And the outcome, I don't have it. The outcome is this publication titled Reintegration. So how are we tying all this together? Feminism, locality, transnationalism, there's a lot going on. But I guess it's a very clear question, like does it matter where you are physically when we are talking about digital space for transnational community? And community can, sorry I'm rushing. Community can be community grouped by anything, right? By feminism study, by the place we were born, by the education that we went through. So in a nutshell, I moved to UK when I was 14, didn't get my passport. End of my late 20s, I had to go back to Taiwan. And that few years in Taiwan, I was just thinking, what is this transitioning about? And that whole thing got me start thinking, this experience is so common now, you know, around 2013 to 2016, there's Windrush generation, there's Trump deporting Korean deportees back to South Korea. There's cancellation of all sort of visa. It's a global thing that was happening. And so I left UK when I was 13, but it's until 2017, 2018, I started seeing a lot of short documentaries on the people who went back to their first culture that they are very unfamiliar with. Can they continue their community from afar? So I did this project, the next one please, and without the sound. So the sound is not important. So when I went back to Taiwan, I was just thinking, okay, like my community, I was like educated in art in UK for 10 years. How do we look into this? How do I continue the community without having to legally, rightfully situate in UK? So I put on this event where there's no artwork in the art space, but connecting Taipei, Taichung, Frankfurt, and London, that's in Peckham. So 4 places had this inter-reciprocate wall projecting each other's space onto each other, and every participant had their name registered online, and everyone invited in there to just communicate on their phone. And you're not allowed to really talk verbally in there. So that was almost like a set up documentation of trying to create this real but reflective scenario in the art spaces. Like, yeah, how do we translocally continue our community? So next slides, please. So here's a paper, if you're interested, is this German global study sociologist that asked this very simple question, does it matter where you are? So I also was wanting to kind of go into that question thinking like, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's not, maybe the legality state does not stop you from developing your community and who you are. And that was when I just went back to Taiwan in my first year. But in the second year, I realized it really does matter where you are. So I summarized the paper for you. You can just take a photo of it. It's just like the summary of the paper. But what I wanted to share here is, I'm going to phrase this carefully. So, okay, it's very long. Okay, so the experience of having to negotiate and reintegrate back to the first culture where the world decides that's where I belong, it was an experience of cognitive dissonance because, to put it in a very simple term, is for years and years, I navigate myself in this society. There's a certain rules I learn about myself internally and externally. Suddenly, when those understanding how, when this understanding of how to navigate, when that link breaks, is very similar to, for example, a kid when they used to touch fire, it burns, and suddenly it doesn't. So that breakage of understanding how you connect to yourself and externally can link to so many things, right? And so I started trying to dig into if there's any artwork, materials that I can kind of find an insight from other people's experience, which is all in this book. You can have a read later. So I want to bring the whole talk today back to feminism, and there's a trigger warning here because it's only until like I become part of AFSAR that I start to feel like there is a place that I can start untangle a lot of learning I had to do on my own by myself, growing up in UK since I was 14 as an East Asian woman. And then went back to Taiwan, adopting a different system, learning being a Taiwanese woman in Taiwan when I don't have much experience of growing up there. So coming back to, does it matter where you are? Just by the film poster that we're sharing here, like I want to really, for you to take a second to understand the direction of that question I'm pointing at. So this is a film by a friend. She took a real life event of her friend jump off the bridge outside of Heathrow. And so that friend is what we thought an international student from China. But it was only later when she found that piece of news, found out that information on the newspaper, she learned that she was stateless, she was illegally here, she was not enrolled to any school, and her journey was to come here, make some money, and go back to China as a massage, what's the right term for it? As a massager. So she made, based on that story, she made this whole, she made a film out of this story, and those are the poster in ESEA London, same film, in Japan. Just take a moment. Just take a moment. So yeah, just also want to share a moment when I joined AFSAR. There's a lot of things that is very, you know, being this is everything's very entangled, right? And I think to be part of, to have this platform to kind of start single out certain experience and certain narrative from all the complicated entanglement of migrant history, about societal problem, internal problem. It really was the first time that I kind of tried to comb through like what really happened there. And yeah, anyway, okay, I'm gonna stop talking about myself. I do that when I'm nervous. So the next slide. So I guess in the first publication that supported by Asymmetry is reintegration is all about identity negotiation from within and with the changing society and the outside. So coming back to the digital space of community, I guess this was the topic that was bringing forward for the Proxy Conference that we were talking about right at the beginning. So in the Proxy Conference, I was taking the moment during COVID, taking the incident during COVID as an example of the first time I was receiving Instagram messages for people that I have approximate familiarity with, but never met in person, checking on me, like, are you alright? And this person is a Korean artist based in New York, and because of what happened in the Atlanta shooting, that there's people that I'm not familiar with reaching out, just, you know, for us to check on each other. And in combination of, you know, COVID being quite long for many people, that reaching out was something. So for the Proxy Conference, I was proposing for within 4 of us, for everyone to kind of start thinking about like what can be the vocabulary for this transnational East Asian female community. And we have to not be polite. Like, I felt like we have to start with recognizing a pattern of compromising, a pattern of hurt, a pattern of you're not sure what happened, but maybe I'm being too sensitive. Like, you know, that very vague space that you just never feel like you are entitled enough to talk about, because it's always merged into other issues, right? So if we want to talk about violence, the shooting that happened in the States, there's so many other words and terms that is being used in media to kind of really blur the focus, right? Just watch the video in ESEA Contemporary. I unpacked it a lot more there. So, last thing I would like us to wrap up on today is, based on all the information we shared today, and there's very academic, well-researched material. But I want to end on a note that come back to the idea of co-research. Next slide, please. So this is the framework that I lay out also in the Proxy Conference for us to start thinking through what is considered violent. Because when I start thinking about it, I'm like, oh, that was. And to provide a certain structure maybe for audience or people to think about, maybe they have been fronted or maybe they had the encounter that should be considered as violence against them. But it's been, what's the word? Rushed, overlooked. Right, so if there's any keywords that comes to your head based on our presentation today, given that we are emphasizing on co-research, please send that words to the AFSAR Instagram, and that will be a very, very important material for me to bring this conversation forward. And it's a very difficult conversation for me to talk about, but because of being part of AFSAR, for the first time I feel like, okay, let's start talking about this, and yeah, I'll be really grateful if you also trust me with your reaction to this topic. And also I want to thank Asymmetry for hosting us and making this possible and flying my 3 collaborators into London. They are only here for the last day, so if you have any questions. And so yeah, if we have any questions.
Maybe applause first.
And our time is also we kind of overrun the time a little bit, right? Yeah? Can we just have 10 minutes?
Yeah, maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yay!
I have a pretty broad question, and please feel free to interpret it as you wish, but this is open to all of you. I found everything really, really interesting, and I think an underlying current in all of your work is a kind of decolonization of epistemology and ontology, right? And I find that it's, at least from an academic space, that's almost been impossible, because you can't, a fish can't see out of water, right, for example. And so I'm curious to see, in your own journeys in discovering decolonized or externalized epistemologies and ontologies, what kinds of sources, people, frameworks of knowledge that you've chosen to focus on that challenges the kind of hierarchies of knowledge production that we live in, especially in Western contexts, which is often where the centers of power of art is. Thank you.
I have a lot I want to say, but I'll let you.
No, I think this is really, it's a giant question. We still struggle with it. I think academia, it is, it's kind of we intruding it maybe, but I don't think we have the power. That's why I was suggesting. I think lots of people have been doing it for more than 20 years. It's recognize the necessity of intruding the infrastructure, because we are so much controlled by it. And what can we do? Actually, even when you are talking about those films, it's kind of like this tiny, small first step with that which kind of already doing it, especially when we're also thinking about who can be an example of doing infrastructure. And we are striking for space, yeah, but lots of people have done it before, even from representation to inviting
and infrastructure, like the archive making, about what kind of archive making. Is it institutional approach, or it is other kind of approach? It can be realized in film, for instance. It can be realized into like a print making. But this is kind of what I was talking about, a kind of citational network. So there are many possibilities, but it is so difficult. Yeah, I have to admit that. Yeah.
I think if we're talking about academic sphere and only, then I think it's really good that we are at this step, that we are recognizing the infrastructure of academic heads is space, but it's not an authority of all knowledge. And I think that completely comes through by lived experience. And it comes through by investing the time to investigate living history, like yours, like mine, like everyone's, and find a space that is shareable, and archiving in a different way, online, paper. Yeah, that's my approach in the first book. And that also was a direct response from my graduation thesis is on post-colonialism. I cited a lot. I went back to Taiwan and realized, oh my God, I'm actually from an island that's been colonized. But the evidence of what that term means is so different. The passive information and the structure that you actually have to interact with, negotiate with, is so different than when I was in the UK reading all these books cited in my paper. I've talked about it. It's a very, very different reality. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can do, and it's going to take up a lot of time and, you know, emotional commitment, but it's very good that we now have common shared standpoint, like academic approach has its place, and there's still so many other things. And so, yay, well done to the world.
So as a curator, when I introduce myself in a bunch of strangers, I usually go like this. I do research, I do reading, I do writing, I do eating, cooking, you know, I do all those things. So I say I have a... Rapping. Oh. Yeah, I was a rapper when I was in college. Long story. But yeah, I say I wear a lot of different hats. So even though I call myself as a curator, I'm not really interested in the exhibition as a format that fixes the narratives, but rather I find projects that conflicts me, give me different positions to think in a different way. I would collaborate with artists for research, I will make games, I would be the producer. So I think this role as a curator also has to be questioned a lot, because we also see a lot of like mega, you know, curator figures who try to dominate the narratives and like ask artists to do this and this and that. I also try to conflict that. So when we talk about decolonizing practice, which becomes a no word nowadays, it has to be, I think, more very specific in daily life. It has to be something like cleaning your house. So I don't think as a separate thing that happens in my life, but it's rather rethinking of what I experience in the streets. It could really happen on the table when I have Chinese food, with a friend who came from Cameroon. So this is like, again, like thinking about the friendship kind of intervenes into a way to make a crack of this whole big terminology of decolonizing. So I rather think it, yeah, something to share together, a very simple way, like conversations, not in the like a big thematic like thesis that I have to work on.
Oh, and another thing. In my first book, I was talking to a friend who is from Tanzania, went to New York, and came back to Tanzania, realizing a lot of First World and Second World history were embedded in a song lyric. And it was in there because Tanzania was colonized by Germany, but it was not recorded. So she started unpicking all this lyric because the colonizers, they don't speak the language. So that's her whole journey of unpicking. And I realized in Taiwanese song, like Taiwanese language, not Mandarin, there's so many of those things in there as well. And so there's so many different access points, but it's a really good step that we can separate ourselves from like the ivory tower of Western academia. It's nice to choose how far and close we want to get, I think.
I want to add on one more. I can relate to all your comments about these questions. And that, yeah, all these kind of like big questions, how can you solve it? I personally think we need a different axis of the thinking. So horizontally, we need a daily practices like what you mentioned, but we also need another axis, like vertical axis, which require the frame of the thought. So it can be academia, it can be something else. But we need to combine all these different axes in order to dismantle it. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I also often think about whenever talking about other thought, is easily fall into this fantasizing the other thought, and how can I break it? But I personally believe rather than giving another solution for certain problem, like giving answer A, answer B, answer C, I believe, like for example, in terms of Orientalism can be only overcome by Orientalism itself. That's one of my believings for my art practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Any other questions? Yeah.
No, that's okay, I suppose. Thank you for these wonderful talks. It's a question regarding the way you operate through gaming or how you appropriate gaming culture, which I believe in East Asia and Southeast Asia too. I mean, gaming culture and incel culture is really big. It's quite misogynistic and anti-feminist. So from that standpoint, I think your work could be read as a critique or form of appropriation of gaming culture, kind of cyber-feminist and infrastructural critique of that. But I have the impression from listening to your presentations that the way you got into developing these games and that game language of gaming was perhaps more organic or pragmatic. So just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. So, yeah, I have a lot to talk. But anyway, in the YouTube, there's this amazing YouTube called Feminist Frequency, which deals the whole problem of the feminist practice around the game industry. So it has been a very macho culture, But when I was a kid, so I was actually born in the United States, and my dad would also always play game with me. So instead of dolls, I had all these Game Boys. Yeah, but anyway, so how we approached the game was, yes, there are so many aspects in the game, and we don't idolize the game itself, because it's also, again, another culture, another practice. So bringing that itself doesn't mean that we are innocent, but we are trying to find our own way to use the game to activate each of our characters. So in the same time, we kind of problematize how game narratives has been regulating the characters as well. So when you have a character and when you're in the game, you have a freedom to not be yourself, but at the same time you're again in the system that is actually very intertwined in our reality. So we wanted to find a way to add layer on it. So we are interested in that aspect, how to activate the interaction, how to activate the stories. And Mooni and I personally also talked a lot about the fact of subcultures. We're more interested in how subcultures, they actually go beyond the singular narrative. Like there are people, the communities, they play around the character, making new narrative stories, and they actually interact with each other with this new narratives, which is very active. It's not like the audience you meet in the museum. So we use this game to kind of think of that aspect. And for spoiler, we're actually also preparing another Proxy Conference. And I think this discussion
is also, it involves what kind of game do we want to play together. So this time it was just 4 of us, and imagine if we want to invite other practitioners, and if we kind of talk about the game that we want to play. Again, another cultural references come inside. It could be a very classical game. It could be a very classical game. It could be a very complicated game, but it's not about the graph.
Oh, sorry, it's what's this? Yeah, so the rainbow of the game that we consider is really broad. But then also through this project, I start watching those live streaming gamer, and like you said, it is a very male dominant, and also it's an interesting space. I have to watch all this video to kind of get what's the language. But I think when we're talking about game, it's not just about game in a setting, but very much just a different strategy to spend time together. And sometimes when you are forced to spend time together, you have to sit through this game, unexpected conversation come out, because you are just there and things come out, right? Anything on games?
I think because of time, maybe if you don't have questions, we can wrap up here.
There's tea and coffee, and of course everyone can get everyone's Instagram. They're leaving London already tomorrow, so I just want to say thank you again to Asymmetry and EC Contemporary, and Hanlu, if you are watching, thank you so much for the introduction. Okay, thank you everyone also for being here.